Welcome to Fatal Files. Nathan here. I used to think Niagara Falls was safe, something I could admire from a distance, until these stories shattered my illusions. From a young woman chasing the perfect shot above the falls, to a man who trusted every stroke of his paddle, until the water swallowed him whole in the most unimaginable way. It was May 14th, 2017, along the upstream stretch of Niagara Falls on the American side. The morning air felt calm, but the wind moved in uneven pulses through the gorge, shifting without warning. The river below looked controlled from a distance, but toward the center channel, it accelerated, feeding everything toward the drop. Paragliding wasn't permitted in that area. The airspace was heavily restricted due to unstable wind conditions and the immediate danger posed by the river below. Lindy Vrack was 29. She worked freelance, filming outdoor content and short clips for online audiences. The kind of person who stayed active, always looking for a shot that felt a little more dynamic than the last. She wasn't reckless, but she was comfortable pushing closer to limits than most people would. Honestly, this is the kind of mindset that feels safe in the moment. You've done similar things before, nothing went wrong, and that slowly builds a confidence that doesn't always match the risk. That morning, she had a friend with her, filming from the ground while she prepared for a short paraglider run. She launched from a grassy stretch upstream, outside the main viewing areas, where foot traffic was minimal that early in the morning. The plan was simple: stay low, follow the river's direction, and get a clean pass for the camera. From where she took off, the falls weren't immediately visible, but the pull of the river was already there. At first, everything looked controlled. She gained lift and settled into a glide around 80 to 100 feet above the ground. For several seconds, her path stayed parallel to the riverbank. Her friend kept filming, tracking her movement as she drifted farther out. Then the shift started. Over the next stretch, she moved gradually toward the middle of the river. It wasn't sudden. It was slow enough that it might not have looked wrong right away. The wind pushed from the side, just enough to change her line. Then, one side of the canopy dipped slightly, uneven lift pulling her offline. Not a full collapse, but enough that her brake input didn't fully correct the turn, and her direction kept shifting toward the center. From that point, the glide stopped being controlled. She adjusted, trying to correct her angle, but the canopy didn't fully respond. It stayed inflated, but her direction kept carrying forward, and at that height, there wasn't much margin to work with. The river below was moving faster now. You can actually see that transition if you've ever stood there. The water smooths out, then starts accelerating. That's exactly where she was heading. I think this is the part people underestimate. It doesn't take a dramatic failure, just a small loss of control in the wrong place. This is one of the most overlooked dangers here, the moment where nothing looks wrong yet, but control is already slipping away. As she neared the brink, the air changed again. The flow over the falls creates instability, updrafts and downward pull happening at the same time. Her descent rate increased, and whatever control she still had wasn't enough to redirect. She crossed the edge still in the harness. From there, it was a direct drop of roughly 160 feet. The entire drift was captured on video by her friend on the ground, showing her gradual movement toward the center current before she disappeared over the edge. Search crews began working the lower river later that day. They located her downstream after several hours. The injuries documented were consistent with a high-impact fall into water at that height. Investigators reviewed the footage and the conditions the morning. The findings pointed to unstable wind patterns and gradual lateral drift toward the center current. No equipment failure was identified. In the end, it came down to positioning. She didn't start in danger, she drifted into it, a series of small shifts that didn't look serious until there was no room left to recover. And if Lindy's story shows how quickly control can slip away in the air, the next case shows something even more unforgiving. What happens when someone willingly enters that same current, believing they've prepared for the fall? Louis Drom's attempt didn't fail gradually. It failed all at once. It was August 2, 2016, along the upper stretch of Niagara Falls near the Canadian side. The river looked deceptively calm from the shoreline, wide and steady, but the current underneath was already accelerating. The water level was higher than usual, pushing faster toward the drop. From a distance, it didn't look violent yet, but everything was already moving in one direction. Louis Drom was 41. He worked in general labor and spent much of his free time building things, testing ideas, and documenting small stunt attempts. Not professionally, just someone who liked proving something could be done. He wasn't reckless in the usual sense, but he pushed limits a little further each time. This trip wasn't random. He had been planning it, building a barrel he believed could handle the descent. The barrel was wooden, reinforced with metal bands, built in sections and tightened from the outside. It wasn't crude, but it wasn't engineered beyond basic reinforcement. Inside, there was padding, but it was uneven and didn't hold him in place. There were no restraints, nothing to stop his body from shifting once movement started. 2 people with him stayed on shore, filming as he positioned the barrel at the river's edge upstream, keeping their distance from the main areas to avoid attention. From where they launched, the falls weren't immediately visible, but the pull of the current was constant. Even at the edge, the water didn't sit still. It moved forward, slow but steady. Once the barrel entered the river, there was no way to stop or redirect it. At first, the movement looked manageable. The barrel floated upright, drifting with the surface flow. For a short distance, it didn't appear unstable. The camera followed as it moved farther out, slowly getting pulled into stronger water. Then, the rotation started. At first, it was subtle, a slight turn as the current shifted underneath it, but the river wasn't uniform. The current wasn't even, and the barrel reacted to every shift beneath it. It began rotating more noticeably, each turn pulling it off balance. Within seconds, the rotation became constant. The barrel didn't glide. It reacted to every shift beneath it. It picked up speed as it spun, each turn tighter and less controlled. There was no pause anymore. It didn't stabilize. It just kept turning. This is the moment it stops being manageable. From the outside, nothing seems extreme, but the way it's turning tells me I've already lost control. Inside the barrel, every rotation meant impact. Without a harness, his body had nothing to anchor to. Each spin forced him into a different side, back, shoulder, legs, then immediately into another. The padding softened some of it, but not enough to absorb repeated force. There was no pattern to brace against, just continuous motion with no break between collisions. From the shoreline, the change is visible. The barrel stops drifting and starts reacting, accelerating, rotating faster as it's pulled toward the center channel. As it approached the brink, the speed increased again. The surface of the water changed just before the drop, smoothing briefly as everything accelerated forward. The barrel didn't steady. It carried its rotation through that final stretch. Then it tipped forward and disappeared over the edge. The drop that followed was roughly 160 feet. There were no direct witnesses to the impact, but the aftermath filled in what couldn't be seen. When the barrel hit the base, it struck the water with enough force to break apart. The wooden structure gave way on impact, the frame breaking apart as the barrel failed to hold together. He was no longer contained. Debris was recovered first. Fragments of wood and metal scattered downstream. The current spread everything across the lower river. His body was located later in the same area. The injuries were consistent with high-impact trauma combined with structural failure at impact. Investigators examined what remained of the barrel and reviewed the footage. There were no sudden environmental changes, just the river and the limits of the design. The structure couldn't withstand the drop, and the interior offered no stabilization once rotation began. The footage shows how early the movement becomes unstable. Once the barrel starts rotating, it never recovers, only picking up speed as it's carried toward the brink. What comes next shifts away from preparation entirely. This next case isn't about building something or planning for it. It's about being caught in a situation where the environment changes faster than a person can react. It was June 9, 2018, in a less trafficked section of the Niagara Falls Gorge. The air moving through that area wasn't constant. It came in waves, steady for a moment, then shifting as it funneled between the rock walls. The river below moved fast but uneven, with sections of smooth surface broken by turbulence where the current hit rock formations. From above, it didn't look chaotic, but the movement never really stopped. What most people nearby didn't realize at the time was that the setup itself wasn't authorized. No permits had been issued for any kind of rigging or performance in that section of the gorge, and the line had been installed illegally, without oversight, inspection, or safety approval. Olivia Gorp was 34. She worked in small, live performances, mostly balance and coordination acts, the kind you'd see at local events or temporary setups. She had experience walking lines, but usually in controlled environments. Lower heights, secured rigs, predictable conditions. This time was different. She wanted something more dramatic, something that would stand out on video. She arrived early with 2 people who helped her set up the line. They chose a narrower span of the gorge where the distance between rock faces was shorter. The rope was anchored on both sides using portable gear fixed into uneven rock. It held tension, but it wasn't deeply secured into stable ground. Without any formal safety checks or regulated anchoring systems, everything depended entirely on how well those temporary points held. A few bystanders gathered as the setup became visible. Some of them started, recording before she even stepped onto the line. From where she started, the drop below was roughly 100 feet to the river. Not vertical the entire way, there were rock faces and ledges, but there was no safe landing area. She stepped onto the rope with a balancing pole, moving slowly at first. The line held. It dipped slightly under her weight, but that was expected. For the first few steps, everything looked stable. Then the movement started to change. As she got closer to the middle, the rope sagged more noticeably. Not dramatically, but enough to shift her footing. The anchors were holding, but the tension wasn't consistent. The line had a slight give that hadn't been there at the start. I don't notice anything wrong at first, but this is usually where situations like this begin to break down. As her weight centered on the line, one of the anchor points shifted. Not a full release, just a small movement in the rock. But that was enough. The rope dropped several inches instantly. That change shifted her balance forward. The line beneath her feet lost its firmness, turning unstable in a way that couldn't be corrected quickly. She adjusted her stance, trying to regain control, but the slack created uneven movement along the rope. Within seconds, her footing gave out. She fell from the line, dropping toward the rock wall below. Witness recordings captured the fall, showing contact with the side of the gorge before she disappeared into the river. The impact redirected her downward at an angle with no chance to slow or recover. There were no immediate rescue options from that position. The terrain made direct access difficult, and the current below continued moving downstream. Search efforts focused on the lower river area. Several hours later, her body was recovered downstream from the fall site. The injuries documented were consistent with a high fall and impact with rock before entering the water. Investigators examined the setup left, behind. The rope, anchors, and positioning were all reviewed. The conclusion pointed to anchor instability and inadequate securing as the primary cause of failure. Factors made more critical by the absence of permits, professional rigging standards, and any formal safety oversight. Even small shifts in anchor placement can multiply force across the line, especially over spans like this. Without redundancy or load distribution, a single weak point becomes the entire system's failure point. And the next story moves away from height and balance entirely. This time, the danger doesn't come from above. It comes from being pulled into something that doesn't give you a way back out once you're in it. We've got more disturbing Niagara Falls tragedies coming up, so hit that subscribe button if you want to see how a place that looks controlled can turn even deadlier in seconds. It was April 21st, 2015, along the upper shoreline of Niagara Falls. The weather had warmed just enough for more people to move closer to the water. The rocks near the edge were dark and damp, constantly coated by mist drifting in from the falls. From a distance, the river looked slow and wide, but near the shoreline, the current pulled harder than it appeared, feeding into a faster channel that moved straight toward the drop. Stacy Spive was 26. She worked in a general customer-facing job and had taken the trip as a break from routine. She brought her dog with her, the kind that stayed close but still pulled ahead when something caught its attention. She kept it on a retractable leash, letting it move a few feet in front as they walked along the edge. She stepped beyond the main viewing path onto a section of exposed rock closer to the water. It wasn't blocked off completely, but it was worn smooth from constant moisture. A thin layer of algae covered the surface, subtle, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. Even standing on it, there wasn't an immediate sense of danger. It just felt damp, like any other rock along the shoreline, with nothing about it signaling how little traction it actually provided. From where she stood, the river didn't look dangerous. It looked steady, controlled. The surface moved in a way that felt predictable, without sudden shifts or visible turbulence near the edge. Her dog moved first. It stepped onto a slick patch and lost footing, sliding forward into the shallow edge of the current. The water there wasn't deep, but it moved with enough force to carry anything that couldn't regain balance quickly. There was no splash or violent movement, just a clean, continuous slide into motion. The leash tightened instantly. That pull shifted her weight forward. She tried to brace, but the surface under her feet offered almost no resistance. One step turned into a slide, and within a second, she was pulled down onto the rock and into the water. There wasn't a clear moment where she could stop it, just a gradual loss of control that became irreversible almost immediately. From there, everything accelerated. The shoreline dropped into moving water that fed directly into a stronger channel. She reached toward nearby rock, but the combination of speed and slick surface made it impossible to hold position. The current didn't surge or crash. It stayed low and consistent, which made it harder to recognize how much force it carried. It wasn't chaotic water. It was steady pressure, continuous and directional, keeping anything caught in it moving forward without pause. I keep coming back to that moment. It looks like something that could be corrected, but it isn't. The current doesn't give you time to stabilize or reset. What starts as a small slip becomes full movement almost immediately, with no stable point to recover from. And the longer you're in that motion, the less control you have, until you're no longer reacting. You're just being carried. Witnesses nearby saw her enter the water and move downstream quickly. The distance between where she fell and where the current intensified wasn't far. Within seconds, she and the dog were pulled into the main flow. There was no way back to the shoreline. She was carried toward the brink along a channel that didn't slow or break. The surface smoothed slightly as it approached the edge, almost flattening out, then disappeared over the drop. There was no visible marker of where recovery stopped being possible. Just a continuous path that led forward with no interruption. There were no recovery options at that point. Search crews focused on the lower river later that day. Both were located downstream after several hours. The injuries documented were consistent with a fall from height and impact with water at high velocity. Investigators determined the cause as loss of footing on algae-covered rock, combined with leash tension pulling her off balance into fast-moving water. And the next story takes that same idea of misjudging movement, but in a completely different setting. This time, it involves someone who understood the water, had experience in it, and still ended up being carried somewhere they couldn't recover from. It was September 11th, 2017, along the upper section of Niagara Falls near the Canadian side. The river didn't look aggressive at first. It stretched wide, with long sections of smooth water that gave the impression of control. But underneath that surface, the current was already building speed, pulling everything toward a narrowing channel that fed directly into the falls. Darius Flawn was 38. He worked in a general warehouse job and spent his free time outdoors, usually on the water. He had experienced kayaking, mostly on calmer rivers where movement was predictable and recovery was possible. He wasn't new to it, but he also wasn't used to water that didn't give you options. That day, he launched from a point upstream, setting into the river with a helmet-mounted camera recording his run. There was no support team nearby, no one following along the shoreline, just him moving with the current. At the start, everything looked controlled. The kayak tracked straight, cutting through the water cleanly. For a short distance, the surface stayed manageable, with only small ripples breaking the flow. From the camera perspective, it didn't look much different from a standard river run, but that changed gradually. As he moved farther downstream, the current began to build. The water didn't just move forward, it started to pull faster, tightening into a stronger flow. Small rotations formed along the surface, subtle at first, but enough to affect direction. I think this is where people misread situations like this. I personally think experience can give a false sense of control, especially when the environment looks familiar at the start. His strokes continued, but the response started to fade. The kayak no longer reacted the same way. Each attempt to angle toward the side had less effect than the last. Then the spin started. The kayak entered uneven current, starting to turn off line with each correction. It wasn't a full flip, but it was enough to disrupt direction completely. The forward pull didn't stop. it increased. From that point on, the movement wasn't something he could counter. He continued paddling, trying to break out of the current and angle toward the shoreline, but the current overpowered each stroke. The water beneath him was moving faster than anything he could generate. What becomes clear in cases like this is how quickly options disappear. At first, there are choices. Angle left, angle right, slow down. But once the current takes full control, those options stop working one by one. As he approached the brink, the surface changed again. The water smoothed out, flattening as it accelerated forward. That transition point didn't leave room for correction. He was carried over the edge, still inside the kayak. The drop that followed was over 150 feet. There were no direct witnesses to the impact, but the camera footage ended at the brink, confirming the sequence up to that point. Search crews moved into the lower river later that day. The kayak and his body were recovered downstream after several hours. The injuries documented were consistent with a high-impact fall, combined with contact from the kayak during descent. Investigators reviewed the footage and the river conditions. The conclusion pointed to loss of control and accelerating current, with no viable path to exit once he entered the faster channel. I remember a time I was on the water myself. Nothing extreme, just a steady current. But there was a moment where my paddle stopped doing what I expected. I was still moving, still upright, but I could feel that slight delay between action and response, like the river was starting to ignore me. That feeling didn't last long before I got back to calmer water, but it stuck with me. Thinking about this, I can't shake the idea that he might have felt that same shift, just longer, just stronger, until it didn't let go.